This is the Practical Homeopathy Podcast, episode number 139 with Joette Calabrese.
Hi, I'm Joette Calabrese, and I welcome you to our healthcare movement, yours, mine, and the countless men and women across the globe who have retaken control of their family's health with practical homeopathy. So, for the next few minutes, let's link our arms as I demystify homeopathy, what was once considered an esoteric paradigm, into an understandable, reproducible, safe, and effective healthcare solution available to all. This is the medicine you've been searching for, my unique brand of homeopathy, practical homeopathy.
This is Kate. I want to welcome you back to the podcast. I'm here today with Joette. Hi, Joette.
Hi, Kate.
And we love doing these podcasts because we have a lot to share. You have so much wisdom that you have really gained over your many, many years in practice and teaching. And so today we want to welcome those of you who maybe are listening to the podcast for the first time. You are in the right place and you're going to love what is shared today. It's information that you are going to be able to use right away. And for those listeners who've been with us for a while, we want to welcome you back. Thanks for being here. So Joette, you have an adventure that you went on recently. I call it an adventure, but you may not. Tell us what you've been up to.
Well, I just got back from the dentist.
Ooh, most people are thinking right now, ugh,
I know. So I don't go to a local dentist. I actually travel 5.5 hours to get to this dentist in Ohio, and it's worth it to me. My husband drives. I sit in the car. I often work, and I see the dentist, and then we turn around and drive another 5.5 hours to get back home again.
Okay, so why travel 5.5 hours?
The reason I travel that far is because I don't find someone locally that I have the same kind of regard for. I find that a dentist is worth spending the time traveling to get to because I want good quality care. And I want someone who thinks like I do. And this dentist is a Weston A. Price Foundation contributor. He believes in the Weston A. Price Foundation methods, and he's seasoned. He's got a nice amount of gray hair, so he has a lot of experience. And I've been going to him for a few years. I don't go very often. I only go once a year now. But he's a unique man. Interestingly, his father was a dentist, but his father was a conventional dentist. And I would call this particular dentist biological. And that's the only kind that I would ever consider going to. So his father was a conventionally trained dentist and remained so. But his grandfather associated with Dr. Weston Price. And they knew each other. And that influenced what this dentist is doing. So let me also say parenthetically, if you think you're only influencing your children with your ideas, with your use of homeopathy, with your nutritional information, you are wrong. You're actually influencing the next generation after them. Because it's not uncommon for children to question or even deny what their parents have been teaching them. But the grandchildren often listen to their grandparents instead of their own parents. And this is a case in fact.
I think it's true. Grandparents have a large influence on grandchildren for those grandchildren who spend time with them. I remember spending a lot of time with my grandparents and, how the traditional cooking methods that they used, the farming. And I got a lot of those skills and the desire to do things that way from my grandparents. So it's very interesting, isn't it, Joette? How does that relate to you with your grandmother?
It works that way for me, too. Now, my grandmother died when I was a teenager, but my mother gave birth to me and my brother in a hospital, and she was given drugs. And she nursed us, but not for very long because she was pressured away from it. On the other hand, my grandmothers, both sides, gave birth to their children in their own bedrooms, and they nursed their children for long periods of time. And they also eschewed drugs and medicine of commerce. They felt it was their duty to figure it out on their own. And when their child was sick, they gave them chicken soup. Or they went into the backyard and pulled up mint or basil or garlic or cardoons. And so I learned a lot from them, actually through my mother, because my mother did start taking on her mother's ways as she aged. She reverted back. And so it was taught to me a little bit by my grandmother and even more from my mother.
So, Joette, what is a biological dentist?
Well, the term biological dentist means that the dentist is looking at the whole person, and they recognize that what's going on in the mouth is keenly connected to the rest of the body. Now, some dentists call themselves biological because they've been to some courses, but others don't even call themselves biological, and yet they do carry on that tradition of looking at the person as a whole person. What that means is that we can make the association between sinus concerns and chronic dental conditions. That makes rather good sense, right? It's only millimeters away, the separation between the sinuses and the teeth. But how about looking at chronic fatigue as part of, say, a long-term infection? Many times, dental infections go unnoted because X-rays show them, but unless the dentist is trained, such as most biological dentists, they don't see an infection that is below the gum, well into the bone, and is barely noticeable at all unless someone is trained specifically. So the reason I go to this biological dentist is because he was trained that way. He can see a necrosis of the bone. Another way of saying it is cavitation. Another way of saying is osteomyelitis that other dentists in my life never saw, but he did see it. What he saw in my mandible was actually 3 infections, 2 of them that were as a result of having my wisdom teeth extracted back in 1979. Those 2 sites of the wisdom teeth became infected. I knew it at the time. They were extracted, I might say, parenthetically, superfluously. There was nothing wrong with my wisdom teeth. I didn't even know I had them. I was being what I thought was smart in applying preventative medicine and just having them out because that's what you did when you were in your 20s. And so I had all 4 of them extracted and 2 of them got infected. It was followed up with antibiotics and I thought that was it. Bob's your uncle. I'm done. However, what happened was they festered and they stayed infected and grew to a larger infection. And one of them then led to the next adjacent area of the jaw. And I ended up with 3 infections. So I had one in number 32 and 31, as well as number 17.
Did you feel the pain or anything? Did you know you had this?
I had no idea. I never felt any pain. I never noticed anything. Now, if I really thought about it, I might have noticed that sometimes my jaw clicked on one side occasionally, but that was about it. And it wasn't until the adjacent tooth got infected because it was cracked, and I actually had a fracture, that when that was extracted, that was number 31, I had seen another dentist who said, you know, this is a pretty deep infection you've got here. So he extracted the tooth. I asked him to please scrape the bone and remove the ligament to make sure that there was no infection remaining, and yet it festered and stayed down into that bone long after. And that's what this dentist that I travel so far to get to found on an X-ray. But what I also like about the dentist that I see is that he also saw it on a sonogram. The sonogram is sometimes called a cavitat, and it shows on the screen the density of the bone, and it was quite alarming what I saw on that, not only the X-ray that he pointed out to me and showed me how to read this X-ray, but also on the sonogram, it really looked like I probably didn't have much bone left at all on my right side. Quite alarming.
Yeah, and there are pictures actually of your sonogram in the antibiotic alternative course. For those people who do want to know more about Joette's story and what she did, you can find that information in antibiotic alternative.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into exactly how I approached it because it takes a little bit more information than we've got time for on this podcast. But I will tell you that most dentists want to debride. Of course, there's an infection. Debriding means that the area is surgically open and the necrosized bone is removed. But I have to say, my friends, it's not a bone after 30 some years of infection. It's really necroses. And so that is what this dentist, who I hold in high regard, wanted to do. But he was also willing, because he knew that I used homeopathy, he was willing to go along with what I wanted to do. And that was I wanted to treat it homeopathically. Only homeopathy. No surgery. Using only homeopathic medicines that I had learned by observing the Banerjees in Calcutta when they treated osteomyelitis time and again. And let me say, what I saw in the Prasanta Banerjee Homeopathic Research Foundation, I never saw them use this method for someone who had their wisdom teeth extracted. It is a distinctly American thing to do, to have your wisdom teeth extracted for no reason other than they exist. What I saw instead there was laborers who had an injury to a bone, the tibia, for example. And not long after, maybe 6 months, 8, 10 months later, there was an infection. Perhaps there was a swelling, perhaps there was a fever. The person was fatigued, and they knew that ever since that bone injury that they haven't been well. And it was pretty clear that indeed there was an infection in their bones. They would come with the x-rays. So I saw what Dr. Pradeep Banerjee used for those kinds of infections and then applied that same information for the infections in my mandible. It took time. I had to use the medicines for a couple of years. But over that period of time, things changed for me. I used to get a little stiff neck, which I associated more with sleeping incorrectly, but actually I believe was associated with the infection on that side. I was returned to more energy. My thinking became clearer. I was able to get more done during the day. And in general, I felt improved. That's the best way to put it. I just felt improved. Now, what I was experiencing before was, and I'll go back to that, I had fatigue. And I often found that it felt like I kept saying to myself, it feels like I'm getting an infection. Every time I said that, I would rub the back of my neck on the right side because that's where the two were located. I would rub the back of my neck and it felt like I was catching something. And then it would go away for a while. And then it would come back a few months later. And then it would go away. And I now know that that was the infection in my jaw that was probably working very hard to be resolved. But your body can only do so much with a bone infection. And had I gone back to another dentist, I would have been given exactly what I was given originally in 1979. An antibiotic. And antibiotics, my friends, rarely work for bone infections because they have to go into the bloodstream, and the bloodstream then has to take it through the veins into the area. And the jaw, the mandible, and the maxillary have very little to do with the vascular system. The veins simply can't carry into the bone. And it's not just for mandible and maxillary in the mouth. It's also for the tibia and any other bones in the body, which is why when we see someone has a bone infection, whether it's from diabetes in the toes, or it's an injury in the tibia, for example, or again in the mouth, we see that antibiotics don't act. And then more of the bone has to be removed because, again, it turns to gangrene. That's what necrosis is. It's gangrenous. So over the years, I would go see this dentist. He would take an x-ray, and sometimes we didn't even use the x-ray. We just used the sonogram, and it would show that there was improvement. The bone was growing back. The infection was not as noteworthy. The sonogram showed that there was density building in again. And I would stay with the homeopathic medicines, and I'd go back again 6, 8, 10 months later. And indeed, it was growing back even further. And so although I don't like going to dentists in general, I really enjoy going to this dentist because I just got back and it showed that my bone is completely grown. It's been like that now for about 3 years. It has filled in. The infection is gone. 3 infections are gone. That is remarkable. As I said, I won't go into exactly how I did it. I'm sorry, you'll have to go to the course that I teach more about it because it is rather extensive, but it's worth knowing about. And ever since this occurred years ago, when I've taken any new cases on with clients, I always ask them for their dental history. Because a lot of times if we use a homeopathic medicine for, let's say, for chronic fatigue or joint pain or stiff neck or even many other conditions, we use the medicines that are appropriate, yet they're not acting as they should. My thought then is, so tell me about how many teeth you've had extracted. And more often than not, they tell me, oh yeah, well, I had 7 teeth extracted when I was a teenager because my jaw was too narrow and I had to have orthodontal work, etc. And ever since then, I've never been quite the same. So I am now a suspicious homeopath. I'm suspicious anytime someone has had a tooth extracted and they have chronic illness. And again, that's what a biological dentist is looking for. What is the chronic illness that could be associated with an old cavitation that is still bubbling over many, many years, even decades later? Mine was over 33 years old before I found it. And it made a huge difference in my overall well-being.
I think we can leave listeners, Joette, with a tip about going to the dentist and how you might use homeopathic medicine if they're going to the dentist and they need to get x-rays. What would you suggest?
Let's pull back from this a little. I kind of gave you a pretty heavy story by the way, I have to say that this story about old cavitations causing chronic illness, I've seen it over and over and over again in my practice. And since I started to teach it in our academy and elsewhere, people report to me regularly that by using the specific protocols for cavitations, that they have seen a big shift on many levels. Okay, now let's say you're going to the dentist and you're nervous. One of the best ways to treat that anxiety before going to a dentist is to use Gelsemium 30 the night before, maybe, and the morning of. That will calm down the angst that often accompanies having to approach an anxious event that's forthcoming. But let's say the person is past that. It's not just anxiety, it's downright panic. Then instead of Gelsemium, we would use Aconitum 200, say the morning of, and perhaps if it's needed, another dose just before they get into the dentist's chair if they're super anxious and panicking. So now let's also talk about, like you said, an x-ray. When I get x-rays, and I don't get them very often, once a year, and even that I think is a little bit over the top. And I have not had it done for many years now because we know that everything is in order now. Then I would use the medicine X-ray 30. And that can be used just before the X-ray and then just after the X-ray and then maybe once or twice a day for the next several days up to about a week. And that can approach the fact that X-rays have been used.
Well, that's really helpful. And what an amazing story about healing something that I don't think most dentists would say could be healed without medicine or a surgical procedure. So thank you for sharing. That was really incredible. And I bet you were beyond thrilled to get that news.
Oh, I was. My husband usually sits in the car and waits for me there while I go in to see this dentist. And he sits there with his computer on his lap and he's working. And I often come back practically skipping out of the office because I'm always so delighted with every time the last 3 years the sonogram shows. Indeed, the bone has grown back and the infection is long gone.
Just another win for homeopathy.
Again and again.
Never gets old.
Right? It doesn't. It's fresh every time. Good information. I hope you folks can learn from this and that you pass it on to your children. Not unlike my dentist, it's not just about teaching your children, it's about teaching your grandchildren too.
Yes. Thank you, Joette.
Thank you, Kate. It's my honor to share many lessons on this simple method of using homeopathy for free without affiliates or advertising here in my podcasts, but also my blog posts and Monday Night Lives. But it's critical that you learn how to use these medicines properly. These podcasts should serve as only the beginning of your training. Peruse joetteslearningcenter.com to find fun study group opportunities and in-depth courses developed by subject. So with the proper training, you can join the thousands of students before you in developing the confidence and competence to protect the health of your family and loved ones with my brand of homeopathy, Practical Homeopathy.
You just listened to a podcast from internationally acclaimed homeopath, public speaker, and author, the founder of the Academy of Practical Homeopathy, Joette Calabrese. Joette's podcasts are available on all your favorite podcast apps. To learn more and find out if homeopathy is a good fit for your health strategy, visit practicalhomeopathy.com.